So in this video, we're going to look at the urinary system. The urinary system is designed to clean the blood and filter the plasma and get rid of the waste products as urine. This is the look of the overview of the urinary system. We're going to put things together when we get after we talk about some of the internal structures. The first thing we're going to look at is the internal structures of the kidneys. The kidneys are kind of the organs, the star organs of the whole show. And inside the kidneys, there's going to be several structures you'll need to know. What we're going to look at first is simply the overall, the macroscopic structures. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide, which is the picture to show it, and then come back to this one to show it on this as well. So this is the picture of the kidney. There are a couple things that we'll start with first. First of all there is an outer layer called a renal capsule. It's simply the skin of the kidney. It is this brown outer part here. The other zones, the areas, are going to be internal, and there's two big ones. One of them is called the renal cortex. Now, first of all, renal, anything dealing with the kidney, anytime you hear the word renal, you'll know it's dealing with the kidneys. Renal means kidney. And so we have the renal cortex, which is this outer layer here. So if I was to draw this, and it's not cut perfectly well, but if I was to draw a little line here around, that line is going to divide the two main layers. The first, like we said, is the renal cortex, and the inner layer, as it says here, is the renal medulla. So the renal cortex is above or outside of this layer. The renal medulla is inside of this layer. Now you'll learn as you go along, if you haven't learned this already, that cortex means outer layer and medulla means inner layer. That's why you had the cerebral cortex, the gray layer, the layer of gray matter around the outside of the cerebrum. So these two terms you should get used to. Renal cortex, or cortex, means outer layer. Medulla means inner layer. And so renal means dealing with the kidneys. Now, the renal cortex is going to have a lot of microscopic structures we're going to look at in a minute called nephrons. This kind of shows a picture of one of the nephrons. They are the microscopic structures we'll look at. They're the real functional units of the kidney doing the major work. But inside the renal medulla is where we're going to find some macroscopic structures, some things that you'll need to know, and you won't need a microscope to see. The first one is going to be, and I'm going to use where this renal medulla is layered, but this little guy right here that you'll see repeating all over, there's one here, there's one there, and one here, and one here, right? And then finally here. So they're all over in there. These are called renal pyramids. All right, so they're called renal pyramids. The renal pyramids are basically, they are really a 3D object that looks like a funnel. They're referred to as lobes as well. So inside the renal medulla, you're going to find these little things called renal pyramids. We're going to look at some of the stuff that's going to go on with them a little later on. In between the renal pyramids are these little columns of tissue. This one doesn't show up real well there, and there's another one right there. These are actually referred to as renal columns. So the area of tissue between the renal pyramids is referred to as a renal column. So those are two of the big macroscopic structures here. Now, there's a structure on your sheets called the renal papilla. I'm going to tell you not to worry about that. You can't really see it on here anyway. But what I want to talk about next is the tubing system to get the urine that is formed here out of the kidneys. So each one of these pyramids comes down to a point, and I'm going to have a little area here that's the beginning of a tubing system. Those are called minor calyxes. Minor calyxes are going to be found at the point of every one of these renal pyramids. And at that point, they are starting the process of getting urine out of the kidneys. And so each renal pyramid is going to have a minor calyx. And then these minor calyxes, as they come through, are going to join, and they will form what are called major calyxes. All right, so wherever they group together, it's called a major calyx. And then the major calyxes will end up dumping the urine into this hollow opening called a renal pelvis. Renal pelvis are where all of these calyxes come in, and that is the last little section before it is going to leave the kidneys. Now, I want to point out another thing here. In this little area, and if I kind of circle around all of this with the calyxes, minor and major, and then we're going to have renal artery bringing blood in and the renal vein bringing blood out. This area that's all in here is referred to as the renal sinus. And now I'm not going to ask you anything about that, but I just wanted to point it out because it is on your list of things to know. But it's hard to see because it's got all of these structures in it. And so if I was able to just grab this and just pull it out, this little area that I had circled here would be this little hollow pocket. And it would be the actual renal sinus, because sinus means empty spot. So I hope you can see that. Again, not going to ask you anything about that. So I have minor calyxes coming together, and the minor calyxes are at the end of each one of these renal pyramids. Where they come together are areas of major calyxes. You don't see them on these here because it's been cut. The major calyxes will group together into a renal pelvis, and then the renal pelvis is going to allow this urine to exit on what we'll learn as a ureter. All right, so those are some of the major parts of this. I hope that that makes sense. Again, I'm going to switch to the next slide and look at the model again and show you pretty much the same thing. So this is a picture of the model. We have, again, the renal cortex, and then we have the renal medulla. It is simply the dividing line. Now, the renal cortex, like I said, is going to be the area that is going to have a lot of microscopic structures, which we'll look at in a minute. The renal medulla has the macroscopic. So the big ones are these renal pyramids, right? The renal pyramids, to me, they look like little fish tails. Now, again, in the real world, they would be like little cones, and they're filtering and funneling the urine out. So as the urine comes down, it will start on its journey on one of these things that we learned as a major calyx, or a minor calyx. So the minor calyxes, as they come down, they will join together in areas that we will call major calyxes, right? And then the major calyx they'll all join up at the renal pelvis, which is this hollow area right here, right before it leaves, and it goes out on what we will call a ureter. Again, the whole kidney has this outer skin called a renal capsule, and those are the major parts of the major macroscopic working parts of the kidney. Now, this slide is going to show kind of confusingly the things that we're going to look at now called nephrons. Nephrons are the functional unit. They are the microscopic workhorses, right? And this would be one nephron right here. And sorry, I don't have a mouse, so doing it on this kind of is tough. This is another nephron right here. Right? Now you'll see that the nephrons, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, as they filter the plasma, the end result gets brought into this long tube that we're going to learn called a collecting duct. The collecting duct is going to go all the way down to that minor calyx and drop off the urine. Once it leaves the connecting duct, it is then officially called urine. Now, I'm not going to test you anything on this. It's a little too confusing to see some of it, but I just wanted to point out some structures. Again, this is a picture that's probably a little too complicated as it's showing it, trying to show it a little more lifelike. The big thing on this I want you to see is this is a collecting duct. All right, so this is one nephron right here, and it's going to have a collecting duct. Each nephron, collecting ducts will have multiple nephrons that drain into it. All right, and then this is going to go through the renal pyramid down into the minor calyx. Now, this is the star of the show. This is what we refer to as a nephron, right? So the nephron has two basic parts to it. If I drew a line right through here, this side is what's called the renal capsule, or corpuscle, I should say, excuse me. This side is going to be the renal tubule. The renal tubule is going to have several different spots. There's going to actually be 3 spots, and then this one right here is going to have both an A and a B, and then this here. So there's 3 spots here, 1, 2, 3 that we'll look at. But first we're going to start with the renal corpuscle and kind of see some of the inner workings of what's going on there. Now, the renal corpuscle is going to have 2 parts to it. The one that we're going to start with is called the glomerulus. That is this really, really intricate capillary bed that's inside here. It's got a lot of special properties in order to allow a lot of the plasma to escape the blood vessel. And then the plasma, as it has been filtered out, it's called filtrate, will start on a journey onto the renal tubule. But as the plasma is pulled and pushed out, it is caught in this thing around the outside called the glomerular capsule. So if you imagine that I had a sprinkler, and I could put a sprinkler inside of a room, and as the water is being pushed out, it's being caught by the walls. Well, the walls would be kind of the glomerular capsule. So they capture it and then send it on its way. Now, one other thing I want to point out is blood's going to come in on what we refer to as an afferent arteriole. Afferent means incoming. So the blood's coming in on an afferent arteriole and then leaving on an efferent arteriole. You should have looked at this a little bit in 210 in the nervous system, because sensory neurons are called afferent neurons because they're bringing information in. Motor neurons are called efferent neurons because they're taking information away. So again, hopefully that all that makes sense as we're going through this. So and just to make sure, just to kind of point out, because this is something you'll look at in lecture, there's going to be, remember, this is whole blood coming through here. So we're talking about 55% plasma, 45% what we call formed elements, right? Those cells. Now, the efferent arteriole, as it's coming, because a lot of the plasma is left, you're talking about something like maybe 10% plasma and 90% formed elements. Really thick, very concentrated fluid. And this is going to be a key in how the renal tubule helps absorb and reabsorb things that have been filtered. There's going to be, on average, 180 liters of fluid gets pulled out and filtered through this. Now think about that, 180 liters. That means 92-liter Coke bottles get filtered through your kidneys every 24 hours. That's a lot of stuff. And thank goodness most of it gets reabsorbed, because if it didn't, you would be peeing all of the time, and Depend undergarments would be the most popular form of apparel around. So the next thing we're looking at is the renal tubule. So we start with the first section of the renal tubule. The first section is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted means twisting and turning or confusing, and that's what happens. As soon as this tubule starts, it is all over the place, twisting and turning, and this is where most of the heavy lifting is done. This is where most of the stuff gets reabsorbed. But once it leaves the proximal convoluted tubule, this is going to be twisting and turning, and then all of a sudden, it's going to take this nosedive and dive into the renal pyramid or into the renal medulla. All right, and this fluid's going to go through. Now, this first part here, this is called the descending limb of the nephron loop. And then as it turns around and comes back up, this is now the ascending limb of the nephron loop. Now, some books still have it as the loop of Henle. This whole area, they're doing a lot to try and take out proper names, so it's usually not called the loop of Henle anymore. If you use that, that is 100% correct. But they try to use just basic terms, so it's now just called the nephron loop. All right, so I have one up here. This is the proximal convoluted tubule, and then part 2 with the descending and ascending limbs. This is the nephron loop with those two. And then finally, the last part, once this ascending limb of the nephron loop gets out of the renal pyramid, it goes all crazy again, and it is now called the distal convoluted tubule. Now, as this is going on, each one of these sections, 1, 2, and 3, proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, and distal convoluted tubule, have different things that they do, and you'll learn that in lecture. And here, again, all we're worried about in here is being able, on this part, to identify the structures as they are labeled. So again, we just simply have the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule, which surrounds the glomerulus. Then we have the nephron tubule, which starts with the proximal convoluted tubule, which is in the renal cortex. Then it's going to have this nephron loop that drops into the renal medulla with its descending and ascending limbs. The ascending limb, once it gets back out into the renal cortex, then it goes all crazy again. And at this point, since it is far down the chain on the tube, it is called the distal convoluted tubule. So that's how it starts processing. Now remember, the distal convoluted tubule is going to join several distal convoluted tubules are going to join actually these things called collecting ducts, which will start taking this filtrate down to the minor calyx, at which point when it enters the minor calyx, it is called urine. So this is the overall picture of our model again. This is the look of a couple of nephrons and their associated collecting duct. But as all of this comes down, so the collecting duct's going to drop it off onto a minor calyx. The minor calyx will join another minor calyx to form a major calyx. This empties up into the little area here called the renal pelvis, which is going to take this urine out on a ureter. Now, this picture shows the overall view of things. So we've got our two kidneys. This is the right ureter. This is the left ureter coming here. Now, just to make sure you remember, this is the inferior vena cava. This is the abdominal aorta. So the blue here is going to be the renal vein coming back to the inferior vena cava. This one here is the renal artery that's coming off of the abdominal aorta. Hopefully we knew all those. Now, what we're going to look at in this is going to be as these ureters come down, they come down and empty out into what is called the urinary bladder. Remember to call it the urinary bladder. It's not just bladder. A lot of people will put that, and that's a bad thing. Remember, the urinary bladder is lined with transitional epithelium. I will tell you that will probably be one of the questions. Remember, transitional epithelium line the urinary bladder. That should be an easy one, so hopefully that's one of the reasons why I want to put it on there. I want it to have an easy spot, an easy question. Now, the last thing is going to be this little strange looking triangle. I'm going to outline it and then erase it. But there's a strange looking triangle here. This triangle is what is called the trigon. The trigon is a special area that is not going to have transitional epithelium. And think about it. I'm going to have an opening here and an opening here for our two ureters, and then an opening here, which is going to exit out to what we'll learn is the urethra, which is the tube leaving the urinary bladder. But these three openings that we have here, if the transitional epithelium was to expand, they could cover over those openings and cause an obstruction. So this is an area where it's not going to have transitional epithelium to make sure that those openings are not obstructed. And then, like I had said, this last little thing here, this is the urethra. Remember, there's only one first, to quote my inner Ricky Bobby. There's only one first, so there's only one A because A is first. These two are called ureters. There's no A in ureter, right? So, boy, this looks like a little kid drawing on it, but that's all right. I think it works. So the urethra, there's only one urethra, so you can remember there's only one first. There's only one A. This, again, is going to have all of these kind of labeled on the different things, and I'm not going to go over them again. The one thing I will point out is we're going to look at in the endocrine system a little later on. These little glands, these pyramid-shaped glands on the top of kidneys are called adrenal glands. Ad is Latin for above, and then obviously renal. Renal means kidney, so the word literally means above the kidney. So these are the adrenal glands, and again, we'll talk about them a little later on.